Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Meryl Richards, and I'm the Program Director of Food and Forests at Ceres. And thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We're talking about our new report titled Nature's Price Tag, the Economic Cost of Nature Loss. For today's agenda, we'll begin the webinar with an overview of Ceres' latest report. And I'll introduce you to our impressive panel of investor speakers in just a moment. They are joining us today to discuss their response to the report findings and share how they approach nature and biodiversity-related engagements with portfolio companies. We will have time for audience Q&A at the end of the webinar, so if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. A couple other logistics before we dive in. First of all, the session is being recorded, so the link of the recording will be shared with everyone who registered. You can share that with colleagues if they would also like to view. And lastly, if you need closed captioning, you can select that option in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. I also need to provide you with a disclaimer before we get started. First, competition and antitrust law prohibit agreements and concerted practices that have the object or effect of presenting, restricting, or distorting competition. Ceres doesn't require or seek collective decision-making or action with respect to production operations or other activities. We do facilitate the exchange of public information, but participants must not share or exchange non-public, competitively sensitive information. Participants must also avoid coordination of strategic behavior that impacts competition. For participants today who are investors or asset managers, Ceres does not require or seek collective decision-making with respect to acquiring, holding, disposing, and or voting of securities. All decisions by investor participants are at their sole discretion and made in their individual capacities. I'll leave this up for just a couple seconds so folks can read it if they're interested. Okay, so moving on. An integral focus of the work we're presenting today is the importance of conserving and protecting nature. So I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that Indigenous and Native peoples globally have been caring for and stewarding nature for generations, paying attention to the well-being of both people and the environment. Today, Indigenous groups continue to demonstrate effective conservation, and protecting their rights to lands and territories is critical to slowing and reversing nature loss. With this statement, we mean to respectfully affirm our commitment to recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous people around the world, including through our own work. And I do want to note that Ceres office is in Boston, which is the headquarters of, can you go back one slide, please? Which is the traditional land of the Massachusetts people. Okay, so moving on, we've got three fantastic speakers joining us today. We have Oshni Arachne, who's head of active ownership at Danske Bank Asset Management. Oshni has over 10 years of experience in responsible and sustainable investment. Prior to joining Danske Bank, Oshni worked for the Folksam Group within their responsible investment and corporate governance team. She's also worked for the UN Development Program and with ISS as their global head of global norms, controversies, and pooled engagement. So we're glad to have you with us today, Oshni. Janina Barkovitz is ESG analyst at Union Investment Institutional GmbH. Janina joined Union Investment's portfolio management team as an ESG analyst in 2020. And in her role within the stewardship team, she's dedicated to enhancing the investment strategy that empowers Union Investment to advocate for sustainable and responsible business practices. That includes the development and implementation of a biodiversity strategy. So we're thrilled to have her with us today to talk a bit more about that work. Geneviève Grenon is Responsible Investment Senior Advisor and Biodiversity Expert at Desjardins Global Asset Management. As a member of the Responsible Investment team, Geneviève works as Senior Advisor for the private markets and is expert covering the thematic of biodiversity and natural capital. Geneviève joined Desjardins Global Asset Management in 2021, leveraging the extensive experience that she gained while studying for her master's and doctorate degrees and working as a research associate. So thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm very excited for the conversation that we'll be having later on. I will also want to introduce my colleague, Carolyn Ching, who's Director of Research on Ceres Food and Forest team. She will be presenting the report and then facilitating a discussion with our panelists. So I will now turn it over to Carolyn.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Meryl, for the great introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's joining us today. So to kick it off, you've probably all heard much of this before, but we know very well now that businesses rely on nature for key inputs like food and timber, and businesses also rely on ecosystem services, such as those that support healthy soils, reliable water flows, and stable climate. But as you can see from the findings that we've put on the slide from a number of peer reports, we can see that nature loss and degradation are directly undermining the ability of companies to operate. And our current economic systems exert enormous pressure on nature, and they degrade the very ecosystems they depend on. The escalating rate of nature and biodiversity loss pose a systemic risk to companies, their investors, and they put over half of the world's GDP in jeopardy. And in fact, in 2023, PwC published a report revealing that 55% of global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on natural ecosystems. And that is equivalent to approximately $58 trillion. But we asked ourselves, what does this staggering number mean for investors and the companies that they're invested in? So in this report, we sought to examine that question. How does this trillion-dollar figure translate to corporate risk? And then how can investors engage companies to address that risk? So we quantified the financial costs of nature loss for 8 key sectors listed here: biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, chemicals, consumer goods retail, food and beverage retail, food production, forestry and paper products, household and personal goods, and metals and mining. This report pinpoints sector by sector how nature loss drivers erode the critical ecosystem services and then also create risk. And our hope is that the results of this can inform how investors engage their portfolio companies to take action in order to avoid the environmental impacts, but also reduce their reliance on resource-intensive practices and also build resilience. So at the highest level, our analysis finds that by 2050, nature loss has the potential to create $430 billion in annual losses across the 8 sectors. And over a 5-year period, this would amount to 2.15 trillion in losses. So let me share a little bit more about this approach to analysis so you can get into the details with us. In order to conduct this analysis, we partnered with Cambridge Econometrics. They are a global economics consultancy, and they specialize in building environmental economic models to inform decision making. The first step in the methodology was to identify the ecosystem services on which each of the 8 sectors are either highly or very highly dependent, and we use the Encore database for that information. Second, to quantify each sector's direct reliance on nature, ecosystem services were mapped to the inputs that are needed to produce goods and services. XCO Base has a global database that connects and quantifies emissions and also resource use to economic activities. And so that allowed us to quantify the nature input used by each sector to proxy the scale of their dependency on individual ecosystem services. And we also reviewed academic literature to estimate the associated investment costs for each ecosystem service. So this would be the money that companies would need to spend in order to either maintain, replace, or restore these ecosystem services if they were degraded, so that those companies could maintain the same level of overall sector productivity. So with all of this together, the data quantifying each sector's dependencies, as well as the investment costs, that allowed us to develop a gross value add metric to quantify the value of each ecosystem service. So then in the third step, using a variety of resources, we identified the various ways in which each of these ecosystem services are undermined by the 5 key drivers of nature loss. And then in the fourth step, we used some academic literature to estimate how each nature loss driver will cause ecosystem services to degrade over time under a business as usual scenario. And then finally, by combining all of these factors together, we're able to estimate sector by sector the projected cost of restoring, regenerating, or replacing the degraded ecosystem service for companies in these sectors in order for them to maintain their current economic productivity. So on the next slide, this flow diagram sort of simplifies the model, but in a sense, we traced how the drivers of nature loss are impacting the ecosystem services and how the degradation of those ecosystem services undermines the economic performance for the 8 sectors. So that's kind of what you're seeing here, the impact of the push of the impacts to the ecosystem services and how that flows into the sectors. As with any economic analysis, it is important to acknowledge not just the strengths, of course, we think this is a great analysis, but also its limitations. And so for this one, there are a few limitations to note. First of all, the analysis primarily captures the costs that arise from disruptions to the company's direct operations. So it doesn't fully reflect the costs from value chain disruptions. And then secondly, the modeling focused on physical risks that are linked to nature-related dependencies, and it doesn't include transition risks that stem from nature-related impacts. And that's because there is an inherent challenge in measuring the frequency and the magnitude of transition risks. So the result of these two disclaimers is that in practice, the cost of these sectors, the cost that these sectors would incur is likely much higher than what we have estimated and communicated in our report. So our report contains a risk profile for each of the 8 sectors. And the profiles quantify the potential cost of risk, and it helps to make the financial gravity of a company's ecosystem service dependencies much more tangible. These profiles give a general indication of how we can expect risk to break down for companies in each of these sectors, but it is important that companies do their own assessments to determine how these risks apply to their individual business models, and then also how to identify and appropriately mitigate the risks. So this is the profile for the food sector. This matrix is showing us the potential cost to the food sector that would arise if the ecosystem services, which are the things listed in the y-axis on the left column, if those disappear as the result of the nature loss drivers, which are across the x-axis. So as you can see from this graphic, losses for the food sector are estimated at $253 billion annually. And you can see that the key ecosystem services that would be impacted by nature loss are also listed here: bioremediation, rainfall pattern, biomass provisioning. We talk about some of these technical elements more in the report. So this is one of 8 such profiles that we've included in the report. There's one for each of the 8 sectors. And now we think that investors can use these sector risk profiles as a way to support identifying their engagement priorities. So last year, our team published a report that is titled Exploring Nature Impacts and Dependencies, a Field Guide to 8 Key Sectors. The field guide itself highlights the nature-related impacts and the dependencies for each sector. So for example, it highlights that land and ocean use are very high impact areas for the food sector. And then we have this report, Nature's Price Tag, and it quantifies the cost of land and sea use change to be $40 billion per year. So taking these 2 bits of information together, this can help investors narrow in on the priority topics for company engagement. It could also help identify things that might be less obvious to focus on. And this helps investors to manage their exposure to nature-related risk. And it could also help companies manage their exposure. So with this information, we also included in the report an investor engagement framework in order to help guide engagements with companies on nature. So through research as well as consultation with some investors, we identified 4 key areas of company action. And this is assessing impacts and dependencies, making commitments and setting targets, taking action through the value chain, and also creating an enabling environment. So the first area of the engagement framework focuses on assessing impacts and dependencies. And as you can see on this slide, we've listed 5 key elements that set out a robust assessment. And we highlight each of these in more detail in the report. And as well as we've included a box here that has 2 green flags. So this represents only a sample of what we've highlighted in the report. And these green flags suggest important disclosure elements to look for when evaluating a company's progress toward assessing its impacts and dependencies. So as a starting point, you might come to this section and use these resources, looking to see whether or not companies are assessing their impacts and dependencies. And you might ask, has the company mapped out its full value chain, including the upstream and downstream activities? And if so, has it assessed its value chain for potential impacts and dependencies? The second area of engagement in the framework is on making commitments and setting targets. And the key elements include explicit nature-focused commitment, a time-bound target, a monitoring plan for tracking progress, and alignment with climate commitments and nature targets. So a couple of important green flags to look for in this area is, does the company disclose a commitment to shift their business strategy and models in order to halt and reverse nature loss and to achieve nature positive outcomes? Do the company targets focus on highest priority activities that were identified through the materiality assessments? And then do they have a plan in place to phase in additional targets so that they can ultimately cover all of their material impacts and dependencies throughout their value chain? The third area is taking action. So now that companies are articulating targets and making commitments, do they have a plan and a strategy in order to achieve those targets? And, for example, are they assigning oversight and responsibility to senior leadership to ensure that these plans are taking place? So some green flags for this area include disclosure that showcases that senior leadership has the expertise to oversee assessment and management of nature-related impacts and dependencies and risks and opportunities, or that executive long-term remuneration arrangements link to performance on nature-related issues. And then finally, on creating an enabling environment, the fourth area that we've set out in the engagement framework, it draws attention to company efforts that are supporting, for example, advocating for policy, for regulations that value nature or restrict actions that degrade nature, advocating for ending policies and incentives that are creating harmful outcomes. And some of the green flags that you can look for in this area are company disclosures about how their policy positions and direct lobbying activities align with their nature commitments, and also align with the ambition of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And then you could also look for disclosures that policy advocacy and lobbying activities within trade associations and industry groups align with the Global Biodiversity Framework. So the report lays out all of the key elements of disclosure, as well as more green flags. And please do take a look at the report. One of my colleagues is going to drop a link into the chat for you because it is chock full of great information. So with that, I'd like to transition to our panel discussion, and I'd like to invite our panelists to join me. Ashni, Janina, Genevieve, thank you for taking part in our conversation today. Okay, we'll work on getting everyone spotlighted. There we go. All right. So, as I just kind of went over, we crunched the numbers. We know that nature loss creates a financial risk for companies, amounting to $430 billion per year for the 8 sectors. We know that nature action is essential to address the risk while also creating resiliency and long-term value creation. So I want to ask each of you, as an opening, in your role as an investor, why do you consider it important to engage companies on nature? And then also, what is your reaction to the results of our financial analysis? I'll just pick on one of you to start. Geneviève, do you want to kick us off?
Perfect. Yes, of course. Well, first, thank you for the report. I think it was very insightful, very well done. I think it's one thing to say half our GDP is based on nature, highly, moderately dependent, but it's another to see actual costs derived by sector, and to know that the supply chain is not captured is really impactful. And I think it could be a good tool moving forward in engagements. So I think as an investor, we need to engage on issues that are fundamentally material risks. And it's just a fact, nature is a big one. And so it needs to be part of our engagement strategy. Engagement itself is an important lever that we as investors have to signal that this issue is important to us, and it needs to therefore be integrated into a company's considerations and practices. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Ashni, you're next on my screen. Would you like to chime in?
Happy to, Caroline, and congratulations again on the launch of this report, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this panel. I think similar to what Geneviève also shared now, I mean, admittedly, I think I need to acknowledge that I am, of course, coming in with my perspective and experience on governance and stewardship. But even with that said, to what Geneviève also shared, I think as an investor, I mean, it speaks to our fundamental responsibility here to monitor and manage material risks that may impact on the performance of investments. You know, for us at Danske Bank, as responsible investors, we considered the approaches that we may be able to utilize from our proverbial responsible investment toolbox. And given the crux of the issue or the maturity of data, or the lack thereof at the time, it seemed clear to us that the best or the well-suited approach would be to exercise stewardship. And I think that just to underscore this again, this is part of our fiduciary duty here to consider and manage the risks, and conversely also the opportunities identified by the body of research that you point to, and that this report also adds to, about the risks that are connected to the impacts and dependencies that businesses have on nature.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ashni. And Janina, I'll turn to you as well.
Thanks, Carolyn, and many thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here today and discuss with you all and talk about this really important topic. I would like to start to remind us all about how important healthy ecosystems are, because they kind of underpin every aspect of our lives, from clean water and air to food security, climate stability, even mental well-being in the end. And that's why engaging with nature is so crucial. So when we degrade these systems, we not only harm biodiversity, but we also increase financial and operational risks for businesses and also for society. So from the report, my biggest takeaway is that nature is not free and it has real measurable economic value. And the report shows that industries from agriculture to finance face material risks as ecosystems decline, and that integrating natural capital into decision making is kind of essential for long-term resilience. And so for me, the key message is that protecting nature isn't just an environmental issue, it's a business and also an economic necessity, so to say. So aligning financial systems with nature positive strategies can reduce risks, unlock innovation, and then also secure both our planet and our prosperity.
Thank you, Janina. And I appreciate all of those responses because I think they highlight exactly what we were trying to do with this report, which is that nature has value. And then as an investor, with your fiduciary duty, because of the impacts that it creates to companies, there is a reason to engage on these key issues. Janina, in the report, we break down the cost of nature loss for each sector. We also highlight key dependencies for each sector. I'm curious, from your perspective, what do these findings tell you, and how do you envision that this type of data can inform your engagements?
Yeah, thank you very much. So as an investor and as an active asset manager, engagements are crucial to our day-to-day business. So that's why We have a large stewardship team engaging with all our portfolio companies. And as I said, engaging with nature is essential because kind of everything depends on the services it provides. And when these systems are lost, it's just not only an environmental issue, it translates into real financial and operational risks. So supply chains can be disrupted, agricultural productivity drops, disaster costs rise, and so on and so forth. So to make it short, neglecting nature is expensive, and that's what the report really brings home this message. So one of the most important findings is that nature has a measurable economic value, and companies that rely heavily on natural resources are exposed to significant financial risks. And the report emphasizes this. Biodiversity loss, water scarcity, climate impacts, they are not abstract. They directly affect profitability and investor returns. And for us as an investor, the key takeaway is kind of clear. So we cannot separate financial decision making from environmental realities. And integrating natural capital into investment strategies is no longer optional, it's critical. And by understanding these dependencies and impacts, we can identify risks earlier, allocate capital more responsibly, and then also support businesses that are working towards sustainability. And that's exactly what our engagement is targeted towards. And so the report helps to set that up, to prioritize, to sharpen the engagements, to kind of align and focus on the most material aspects. And in the end, engaging with nature isn't a side conversation anymore. It's central to resilient, forward-looking investment decisions, and that's why it's so important.
Yep, thank you so much, Janina. And Geneviève, as you know, nature and climate are very closely intertwined. How do you manage the interconnectedness of these two topics? And this is something that our report really highlighted, that many of the impacts that happen to nature are driven by climate change. So how do you manage the interconnectedness of these topics? Do you talk with companies about both in tandem, or do you treat them separately? What's your approach here?
Perfect. Yeah, I completely agree. Nature and climate are part of the same conversation. They're not two issues, and we try to bring this into our engagements so that we minimize the number of different issues raised, but also to showcase the link between the two. And I think that helps companies. And it also, I think, reduces stress, because a lot of times when you bring up multiple different subjects, identifying these as different subjects, a company's just going to go, no, we're just focusing on the one. We don't have time for the second. And that's just not the response we want, because we need them to understand how interconnected both the climate and the nature is. However, saying that, we are also aware of the fact that a lot of companies are focusing on emissions and climate, and therefore their strategy is a lot further along than integrating nature. And it's similar to our strategy. So internally, our responsible investment practices are based on 4 broad themes, including low carbon economy and protecting biodiversity and natural capital. So we do separate these two issues to enable us to create multiple strategies and implementation avenues for us. So in addition, when we engage, we also look at focusing our questions on the materiality of the sector and company. So as you showcased in the report, there's multiple different ecosystem services, and a lot of times it's easier to show nature on a specific issue, because we know it interconnects with a lot of issues, but nature as a whole, if the company isn't ready to hear that conversation and to understand, we need to just go slow. So although our goal is for companies to look at nature holistically, we need to start our conversation and understand how far along the journey they are to tailor the conversation to them.
I think that's great. And it's really helpful to know that we don't have to tackle the whole issue in one go. It is possible to break it down to the key nature impacts or ecosystem services. And then I think, like, as you say, it gives an opportunity to start somewhere. But then recognizing that the two are intertwined. So being able to address both, or one issue that can help address climate and nature as well. So in the report, we highlight a model for identifying priority areas for engagement. We highlight that companies could choose, or sorry, investors could engage by assessing sectoral, geographic, or activity exposure in their portfolio companies. We also include a case study on the approach that was used by Danske Bank Asset Management. So Ashni, we're very happy to have you here today. Can you talk about what does your process look like for identifying companies to engage on nature? And then what topics do you bring forward in those discussions?
Yeah. Happy to, and thanks for also citing us or highlighting the work that we've been doing in regards to this. I mean, if I was to take a bit of a step back and go back a few years, in 2023, we carried out an analysis of potential biodiversity impacts within our portfolio. And this was done in an effort to enhance our understanding in the area. So we collaborated with the Impact Institute, as well as utilizing Encore data to evaluate biodiversity risks, impacts, and dependencies in our investment portfolios. And then we began developing an internal biodiversity assessment framework. And this kind of speaks to what Genevieve also pointed to right now, is about understanding or assessing where companies are in their respective journeys. You know, how are they progressing in regards to strategies, and also how are they setting, you know, like how does this also establish our expectations in relation to the management of transition risks or physical risks that are emerging? And then how do we also monitor progress? You know, and now the reason why I also took this step back and highlighted this assessment framework is that, I mean, we need to keep in mind that though a lot of progress has been made in the last 2 years, at the time when we were developing this, the TNFD was also yet to release their framework and recommendations. So our efforts were really a recognition of the need to be able to objectively assess companies in relation to their efforts. So we modeled the framework on the foundation that's provided by the TPI with 5 levels. And I know this is presented in the report, but basically 5 levels to assess the progress of companies. And the resulting underlying indicators under the framework were actually aligned to the TNFD, which then released their recommendations, if I recall, I think around about September of 2023 or so. So it was in parallel. But then we also took into account other guidance and recommendations that were put forward by credible stakeholders within this area that we noted, like Business for Nature, FAIR, for example, and of course the Science Based Targets initiative. And we use this framework then to understand the respective efforts of the companies identified, which formed pretty much a target then of 30 companies. And this selected 30. They represented, or they do represent, I should say, they represent a general cohort across a number of industries that were assessed to have high impact on nature. Assessing those companies and utilizing those insights on the basis of the engagements that were based on the framework to then track progress again. And we've started over time then complementing our understanding based on the Encore data with other company revenue data to better understand, to better inform our understandings about the prospective risks to investments. I mean, I think fundamentally, like my point here is that we see that data is improving over time. But as it continues to, we also need to be iterative in our process of informing those understandings and then tailoring our engagements and stewardship efforts accordingly.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, and appreciate you laying out how you've thought about it internally, how you've evaluated all of the companies that you would be engaging with. And then not only that, once you're once you've identified those companies, how do you prioritize what the topics are? And then recognizing the progress that happens over time and iterating. So yeah, very helpful to hear you lay out the process for Danske Bank Asset Management. In the final portion of the report, we set out in the investor engagement framework for companies, and the framework is organized around the 4 areas of assessing impacts, making commitments and setting targets, engaging in the value chain, and creating an enabling environment. So with each of these areas, the report presents a set of green flags that are, highlighting what to look out for. It would be really interesting to hear from each of you what you look for in your engagements. So maybe Janina, if you can start, how do you evaluate companies on their assessments, and what are some of the key things that you're looking for? Like, what's a couple of green flags that you might name for others on the webinar today?
Yes, sure. Yeah. So at Union Investment, we evaluate company progress through both a risk and an opportunity lens. And we basically look at 3 factors: governance, transparency, and targets. So first, we look for governance and accountability, so to say. So does the board and the senior management have oversight of nature-related risks? And is it integrated into their overall sustainability strategy, climate strategy? So that's the first aspect we look into. Second one is we focus on transparency and metrics, as I said. So we assess whether companies have begun to map and disclose their nature-related dependencies and impacts. So for example, reliance on pollinators or exposure to deforestation or soil degradation. And then TCFD disclosure is a strong positive signal for us, because it kind of shows that the company is measuring what matters in the end. So that's very positive for us. And thirdly, we evaluate targets and actions. So we look for time-bound goals to mitigate key impacts. This could be such as reducing land conversion, restoring ecosystems, improving water stewardship. And then we check whether these targets are linked to capital expenditure or supply chain commitments. So that's the third step we do. And then finally, in the end, we also consider progress over time. So it's not just about making commitments. We also track whether companies report on progress year over year, and they should also demonstrate measurable reductions and embed these considerations into core business decisions. And that's what we are checking as well, to find evidence for that as well. So in the end, this helps us to distinguish between companies that are only seeing the issue and those that are already actively reducing their exposure. So they are acting and contributing to nature positive outcomes. And that's what matters in the end, at least in our perspective. And it also informs our engagement priorities and in the end, also our capital allocation.
That's great. Great to hear on the informing your capital allocation. Geneviève, can you share how you evaluate companies on the rigor of their nature commitments and targets? Like, what are some of the key green flags that you're looking for when talking with companies on that topic?
Yeah, of course. So I think a little like Janina, we have an internal analysis we do on companies, and we review multiple criterias, including their commitments and targets. So just to state that all our dialogues and engagements that we do track them to monitor the progress. Is this positive? Is it lacking progress? Is it going in a really negative direction? So every engagement is benchmarked against themselves. So it's a case-by-case analysis, depending on the conversations and where the company started to where they are now. But having a tracking of these engagements allows us to really understand where a sector is going. So I think to understand commitments and targets, we need to first see where the company is in relationship to the sector and where we want them to go. So similarly to the framework you guys created, we did create a framework to structure our biodiversity engagements. to allow us to drive change more effectively and promote sustainable practices. So the goal was to align our nature dialogues to our framework, to promote the best practices, and to aid in forward momentum and integration of materiality. So I thought to answer the question on commitments, because companies are not all there yet. So I thought to give and share one of our engagements. So specifically with Nature Action 100, we've done an engagement with a company that we pursued for over a year before we started. So when we initially reached out, we right away mentioned it was a conversation surrounding biodiversity and nature practices within the company. We wanted to know what they were doing, what their ambition was, and where they were going. And so it started really slow in that the response was just lacking a little bit to start. But we were a group engagement and we persisted in continuing to reach out because we were committed to making this engagement happen. So once we actually started the dialogue, we found out that they had hired a biodiversity specialist and that they stated they were committed to integrating biodiversity issues into their practices. They had already started this integration through operational impacts and dependencies, and in integrating these issues into their sustainability strategy. They had identified priorities that they were going to focus on, including land use and water risk, and they had completed a water risk assessment to enhance their understanding of what that meant. So although the company hadn't set targets, their forward actions, their transparency during the dialogue, and their commitments to next steps does show that the engagement would qualify as a positive outcome, but also shows their commitment to this issue and to our ask. So we're going to continue with this dialogue, following the company, making sure that they follow through on what they've said they will do, and make sure that their next step is alignment to best practices. So I think for us, a green flag is really positive action instead of just stagnation.
Thank you so much for that example and breaking down all of the ways that you're looking for how you do your dialogue and engagement, and then the various activities that you're looking for. And there's a lot of nuance in that, and it's great to see how bespoke your engagement is with each company. Ashni, can you share how you evaluate the progress on the actions that companies are taking towards achieving their targets? Like, what are some of the green flags that you're looking for when it comes to implementation, taking action?
Yeah. So I do appreciate that this has been shared in the report, but admittedly, perhaps those on the panel have benefited from reading the report in advance. So I do recommend that everybody who's listening in take the time to access the link and read through it. But we are also very transparent on our framework and also the methodology or the underlying methodology that guides the assessment they're under. And then, of course, the attention here is on this report, but if anyone is interested in the underlying indicators and understanding more about this, there is a white paper that we've produced that you are welcome to Google to look it up by my colleague, Mads Steinmüller, or alternatively to reach out to me. But speaking specifically now to assessing company progress on action through the value chain, this is one of the 19 indicators underneath our framework, which looks specifically at this. Namely, we're looking at whether or not the company has made information available on impacts and dependencies in the value chain, and we've outlined what kind of questions are we looking at, or what is the question that we pose in relation to marking whether or not this is considered to be true or publicly available, I should say. But then also speaking to evaluating progress, since we established the target and then conducted the baseline research or the baseline assessment in 2023, we've then undertaken subsequent reassessments of the companies to ascertain what progress, if any, has been made by issuers in regards to their respective efforts and what has been made public in relation to the disclosures. And if I speak really, I guess, high level, there has been noted progress by the companies. It's really encouraging to see this amongst the issuers that we're engaging with. We see this more broadly in relation to the levels of understanding. And again, a demonstration of why stewardship is quite important in terms of supporting understandings in this respect. And I think, if I speak to that specific indicator, for example, as an indication of where we've seen progress over the last 2 years, what we saw is that, or at least what we've been seeing from the subsequent reassessments, is that information in relation to value chain, the disclosures related to that has more than doubled. So when we initially assessed it, it was around, what we saw was 13% of the 30 were disclosing this, and now we're a little over 50%. So you can see incrementally that companies are understanding and seeking to assess this and disclose information in relation to that.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So we have just one last question, and then we'll move to audience questions. So to close us out, going forward, how do each of you envision this new research could fit in or inform your existing process to engage your portfolio companies? And I'm going to shake things up. So Ashni, I'm going to come to you first on this one.
Yeah. So, I think that our engagement targets, they actually cross over a number of industries that belong to about 7 sectors. And this is kind of reflective of our understanding at the time and the intention with gaining more insights, more broadly speaking, because of the absence of data and in relation to the management of risks. So I think now we've benefited from rounding out our understandings, and also not to get into the challenges of aligning different interpretations or different definitions around sector classifications. But what I think the report also will support us doing is about prioritizing those efforts amongst those industries or sectors on the basis of the assessed risks. And then I would think that we would now be moving towards the stage that we're going to prioritize our stewardship approach accordingly to be able to tailor it on the basis of the insights that are provided. That's what I would say.
Great, thank you. Janina, how about you?
Yes, so this research kind of fits naturally into our already existing engagement process, and it helps to focus, it helps to sharpen, and then in the end also to escalate our approach. So first, it strengthens our materiality screening, I would say. So we already assess portfolio companies for climate and also for biodiversity risks. But the sector breakdowns, which are also mentioned in the report, they help us to prioritize sectors and then also companies at the end. Second thing is that it makes our dialogues more targeted, I would say. So instead of broad questions on sustainability, we can ask specific ones, and really specific ones. For example, we can ask food producer how they manage pollination risks, or how infrastructure companies account for flood protection services, and so on and so forth. So that drives more constructive engagement in the end, I would say. Thirdly, it also reinforces our call for standardized disclosure, as I already mentioned before, especially around TNFD aligned reporting. And that's really important to get useful data on nature-related dependencies and impacts. And in the end, it informs our stewardship escalation. So for high exposure sectors, which show little progress, the evidence from this research supports stronger action. And then in the end, this affects how we are setting milestones and how we reflect those insights, those information in our voting decisions, which is one essential part of our stewardship toolkit. So I would say the report doesn't change our process, but it sharpens our process by helping to define priorities, to ask better questions, and then also to strengthen the business case for companies to act.
Thanks, Janina. I think the one thing for me that is resonating is that the report isn't really going to ask for anything new, but it is really something that investors can slot into a process that they're already doing. And Geneviève, I'll have you close us out. And if you could keep your remarks to maybe 1 or 2 minutes, that would be really helpful.
Don't worry. Yeah, well, I think, aligned to just what you said, it's not going to change my engagement framework, but I think it aligns very well. And therefore, it's an extra tool that can be used to, one, understand the sector, just bring a more in-depth on, oh, maybe I didn't consider that ecosystem service, but like we have others. It's just going to be an added analysis that we can use. But I think the really important part is the cost breakdown, is to really be able to say, like, this is how we have been able to model the overall costs of the loss of income, of revenue that as we move forward. So I think it's just an enhanced tool that we can use moving forward that companies can take and learn from. We internally can read and learn from, and it allows people who are just starting to go, okay, I got to do this faster. So I think it jumpstarts a lot of conversations, and that's always to our benefit.
Excellent. Thank you so much for highlighting the cost piece. And thank you to all three of you for joining me today and sharing how you each kind of take what your approach is to stewardship. I think it's really insightful on all of the different elements of information that you look for, the way that you are persisting and working with companies on addressing nature loss. It is so helpful, so impactful, and so necessary. So thank you for all of your work and also for contributing to our conversation. I'll pass the mic back to Meryl, but if you all could stay on camera, we'll do Q&A.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. Agree, really insightful conversation. I do want to bring in some audience questions because we've had several come in, both for our panelists and for you as well, Carolyn. So let me actually start with one for you, Carolyn. How does the investor engagement framework set out in the report align with other frameworks like TNFD, ACT-D, et cetera?
Yep, that's a great question. So our piece on assess focuses on assessments, targets, taking action, and then also the governance piece. And so all of these actually are aligned with the asks of ACT-D, the TNFD LEAP approach, as well as the SBTN 5-step approach towards setting targets. And we have a little graphic in our report that explains how these all map up. So these aren't different asks. They're very much aligned with what's called for, using a number of different standards and guidance.
Great, thank you. We have another question about the losses discussed in the report. So this is one more for Carolyn, and then I've got a few for our investor panelists. Are these losses capital losses or operating losses? So will these actually hit a company's bottom line or just reduce the global natural capital under some model of what that's worth?
Yeah, so these losses relate directly to the operating losses. So this is the GVA. So they represent the reductions in the ongoing economic productivity and output for the company to produce the products or their services that they do. So these losses would affect the company's revenues, costs, and profitability over time. Not just reduce like an abstract stock of environmental wealth. So GVA losses may indirectly relate to capital losses when the investment is discouraged and as future production and potential declines.
Great, thank you, Carolyn. This next one is for all the panelists. So someone's asking, it's helpful hearing how investors can talk about nature with companies, so your stewardship activities. But how are you seeing this translating into investment decisions? So I think some of you touched on this a bit, but if you could dive a little bit deeper into that investment decision question. And maybe I'll start with you, Oshni.
Yep. It was handy that I unmuted to jump in at the same time. So I think it's a really good question, and I think that one thing that's quite admittedly unique also to our approach at Danske is the fact that we try and decentralize a lot of, or try and spread out the information as much as possible in relation to the work that we do within the responsible investment team, and then kind of embedding it with the investment teams themselves that are undertaking the investment management process. So, for example, what I would talk to is, the development of these frameworks, the one that I just elaborated on, the management and integration of ESG related data into our platform, our internal platforms that our portfolio managers have access to, and even the outcomes of the engagement and the dialogues that we have with issuers, which we take out hand in hand in many instances with our portfolio managers, is about supporting them and informing them about the outcomes or the assessments so that they can take a decision in relation to the investments that they manage. And then how it translates is, of course, where it's determined that a company has poor mismanagement or has poor management of a nature-related risk or an incident that has occurred, which can lead to changes in terms of weighting, a decision to sell off, or alternatively, where conversely, as we talked about opportunities, that they might increase weighting. So I think it kind of varies in that regard.
Great, thank you. Genevieve or Janina, would you like to answer that one as well? If not, I can move on to another one. No? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I can add on that. I mean, at Union Investment, we kind of have the same approach. We also have sector tandems where the ESG analysts and the fundamental analysts from the equity or fixed income side come together and discuss all of these issues. So it all comes together. And of course, there's also like a negative and positive screening taking place. But in the end, it's all about the data. So as soon as we have comparable data and a good data quality set, then it's more easier to adapt it in a broad scale. And as of now, or in the beginning, it was all mainly about engagement and largely focusing on reaching out to portfolio companies, discussing risks, discussing the chances or the impacts, positive impacts as well. And now we see a certain shift so that data is increasing, data availability and data quality as well. And that makes it a lot easier to apply in the investment process and in the capital allocation process.
Great, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have a couple more questions, but I think that's all we have time for today. So Genevieve, Janina, Oshni, and Carolyn, of course, thank you so much for all of your thoughts. It's been great to dive more into the report and also hear about how you're all managing nature risk as investors. So note for participants that you will receive a follow-up email with a recording of the session. So as I mentioned at the beginning, feel free to share that with colleagues. You can also learn more about Ceres Nature work streams at the addresses that you see in the chat. And then before we close, I also want to share a few important upcoming events and other initiatives at Ceres. First of all, I invite everyone to consider joining Ceres Freedom to Invest initiative, which brings together investors, companies, and other stakeholders to champion the freedom to consider all material financial risks in their decision making. And you can see the QR code with the link there on the slide. And then please visit ceres.org to learn all about our latest sustainability research, and then also to learn more about our upcoming events. And finally, we really hope you all enjoyed today's webinar. We hope you learned something. We invite you to scan the QR code on the screen to share any feedback that you might have so we can continue to improve and also provide you with the most relevant and interesting content. And here is also the QR code for the report. So anyone who didn't catch that link in the chat, you can use this to download the report and also do the participant survey. So thank you all so much for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks to all of our speakers.